name is Murphy Wardman. I joined General Dynamics in 1958. When I got out of college and I came to Florida to look for a job, I couldn't find one. I was driving up Cape Canaveral and a friend of mine was walking along the road and I picked him up and he said, "Do you want a job?" And I said, "Yeah." So he took me back to the employment office and I became a member of General Dynamics Convair. Tom O'Malley was who hired me. Tom eventually became the test conductor for the Mercury project, and he launched John Glenn. He then went over to the Apollo project. Tom Chitty, who was my lead engineer, was an old guy from the Navy. He was hard-nosed, and he tried to make our life miserable. In fact, the first day I reported to work, he said, "RCA's having a problem down there finding the conduit on the ramp. Go down and figure it out." And I thought, where in the hell was the ramp? I mean, this is the first day I was ever there. I was in the instrumentation group, and Tom was a real hard nose on trying to come up with innovative ways of doing instrumentation. In the old days when we first started, if we had a transducer, we'd go down and pressurize it, and then we'd set the recorder for 0 to 100%. He was determined that we were going to use the electrical calibrations that came with the transducers. So he went on vacation and he left a message for us to do all calibrations using electrical material that we had. Well, we couldn't figure it out. So we went down, did it the old way. He came back, raised hell with us. So back to the drawing boards again. Tom would sit down at the end of we had a row of desks, and I was at one end, and he'd sit there and he'd just stare at you. And he would get under people's skin so bad that he would send Twixes, I guess we sent back in those days, and it'd be from Tom Chitty, and they had answered by saying, answered to Tom Chitty's Twix, which he knew they did it on purpose, but he tried to ignore it as if it was a mistake in the secretary when she sent the thing. I was on Complex 12 as instrumentation engineer at that time. And I decided that one day that all the recorders we had ballpoint pins as marked the traces, and they would skip. So I went in one day and I said, I got an idea. So I took springs and I put up on top of the ballpoint pins. Well, as we got to the end of the test, we'd go all recorders to fast so we could get we'd spread out the measurement. And so when we went to all recorders to fast, the pressure of the ballpoint pen on the paper cut the paper. So every recorder we had, we were drawing our trace, except we were cutting the paper at that point. Needless to say, Tom was not a very happy guy. He used to go along and he would look at a measurement, and he was determined that the instrumentation engineer would know everything, whether it was a mechanic or whatever. We should know what the measurement should be indicating. So he'd go along and he'd look at something and he'd say, "Wardman!" And I'd jump up and I'd run over there and he'd say, "Why is that like that?" Well, one day he said, we were in a count, and he yelled, "Wardman." Well, when we put all the recorders to fast, we had maybe 20 switches, and we had a bar over them, so we could throw that one bar and all the toggle switches would go to fast. So when he yelled "Wardman," I jumped up. The procedure went straight up in the air, it came down, hit the switch, and I put all the recorders on fast. Tom cleared 2 guys that were bent over. So it wasn't long after that I decided I'd transfer to the electrical group. And then that was launch control. I was on probably 140 launches. I was the lead electrical engineer. I was on the John Glenn's first flight on Mercury. I was on Atlas-Centaur, Titan-Centaur, Shuttle-Centaur as lead electrical. In fact, some people said I was the longest in-place lead electrical engineer in the history of the company, which was probably true. One of the big events was TC9. TC9 was a Atlas Able, and we were going to go to the moon. So we were running a static firing, which we used to do in the old days. We'd fire the engines, we'd hold it down to the pad so it couldn't launch. And so this one, we had a plumbing error, and so we ended up with an explosion in the thrust section, and the missile fell over on the pad after it had this big fire. The gel was like 15%, and when it went off, it blew blinds away from the windows at Patrick. The blast wave was so great. Funny part about it, on statics, we all parked our cars out in the parking lot. So when the blast wave came through, it crushed all the roofs and blew all the windows in. And so that night I was riding with a guy named Art Adams, had a little Volkswagen, and we were chugging along the north end of the Cape trying to go home with no windows, the roof crushed in, both doors crushed in. It was quite a sight. The pad was eventually repaired, and we continued launching the C-Series vehicles. I guess one of my most thoughtful points of my life was when we were doing the first Titan-Centaur, and Bill Myers, who was my buddy and friend, and I'd brought him to the launch crew back in the early days, and then he would be my boss, and then I'd be his boss. And so when we were doing the first Titan-Centaur, we decided that we were going to do it different than was ever done at the Cape before. We designed what was called a model print system. That is, one schematic built not only the chassis and the harness and wired the terminal boards. This had never been done before because we used to have nothing but sub-assemblies. So Bill and I designed all the systems. We were in San Diego for about 4 months working with a supervisor's name was Bob Shocklin. And Bob was right in there with us, and so we came up with this completely new system. And then when I came back to the Cape after we did all the design effort, I took two technicians and we went back to San Diego, and we went to the off-site and we started looking for parts. And we went out to Sycamore Canyon, which was an engine test facility, and we were going to take anything we could get our hands on. The foreman would stand up on the hill with a pair of binoculars trying to see where we were going. So we'd split up, and one would head one way so he couldn't see where the other two went, and we'd be shoveling parts in the back of our van that we had. And then we'd have to come back to the plant, and we'd have to sneak back into the plant with the stuff because we weren't supposed to have it to begin with. So we had a semi-trailer parked over by a place called CST, which was supposed to have been a test facility to check out the Atlas-Centaur the Titan-Centaur before it came to the Cape. And it was going to have the Centaur and all the other components in line, like the spacecraft, etc. But that went down the tubes, and so I was going in there to see what we could steal. And there was a big J box, and we wanted that J box real bad. They wouldn't give it to us. So I took the supervisor and the guys over to the corner, and while we were arguing, the two technicians stowed it off the wall and put it in a semi-trailer. Those guys never did know we took that box. We brought those components back here to the Cape. We stripped every switch light that we had out. We relayed, we functionally checked it all. We bagged it, we had an inspector stamp it. And then we started building the panels. So I was assigned a crew to build these panels. And so we also had to have two trailers that were to be dragged along behind the Titan-Centaur as it went down the railroad tracks, because that's how they operated over there. They had a trailer that was hooked to the back of their launch platform, and they would get at the other end, they'd back the trailers into this building, and then the vehicle would be in front of it. They'd close blast-proof doors. So the technicians I were given were the bottom of the barrel. And so my first day I got there, I told them, I said, okay guys, you're the bottom of the barrel. Nobody likes you. You know why you're here. So from then on, these guys got inspired. The two glow track trailers that came out of somebody's trash yard somewhere down in the Cape, we brought up and put them behind the blockhouse, and I went in there with a piece of chalk and I drew on the floor what I wanted. I want a turtle board here, and I want the racks here. And so I turned this over to Ed Stewart and Johnny Marks, and I said, let me know what you need. I was very lucky I had the people and material that would do whatever I kind of asked, as long as it was halfway legal. So I went down to see a buddy of mine named was Digger Junquist. And Digger always said, Murphy, you show up these AVOs and you give me this and I go get this stuff for you, one of us is going to get fired. So I went down there and he says, where's your AVO? I said, well, I don't have one. There was a sandwich bag laying on the floor with a footprint on it. So I bent over and I picked it up and I wrote the parts list on top of the sandwich bag, signed it and gave it to him. And Digger goes, geez, we're really getting bottom of the barrel now. What I do is I get an AVO, it's a sandwich bag with a footprint on the center of it. But anyway, to make a long story short, we completed the installation. The techs I had did such a great job that when we did validation, we did not have one wiring error. And that's kind of unheard of. If we had a failure, it was due to the fact that maybe we had a component relay that didn't work or a switch didn't work. Which takes us on to launches. When we first launched the first Titan-Centaur, we had a 3-battery mission because we were going to run 7 engine starts. And that had never been done on the Centaur before, even though it was restartable once you got in orbit. My supervisor at that time was Jim Sylvester, and so when we got to the end of the count, one of my batteries had surpassed redline, and I said, you know, we can't really launch with a redline here. I need a piece of paper. And so after discussion over the headset and everything, I was told to go ahead and give a go when it came to no or go or no go. And I said, guys, I can't really do that because, one, you're putting me in jeopardy because I have to have a paper to cover myself. No, you've been directed to do it. So that's how we went ahead and launched. I launched this with this one battery that was redline. So afterwards we got in the meeting, and the vice president of the company said, has anybody had a problem? I held my hand up and I said, yeah, I don't ever want to launch again when I have a red line and I don't have coverage, because that puts me in a bad position in case we have a failure or something. And he said, who did that? I said, well, my supervisor. And my supervisor then pumped up and said, no, I didn't tell him. Bob Rice, who was our NASA counterpart, jumped up, went outside, came back in with a tape recorder, and he played the tape showing them where they told me to go ahead and launch even though I had a red line. So after we walked out of the meeting, Jim came up to me and he goes, don't you ever listen to me again when I'm wrong. And I thought, oh, thank you, buddy. So the next launch came along, and he called me up about an hour and a half before launch. He says, I do not want to hear from you again. You're on your own. I was promoted to chief at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was demoted the next day at 8 o'clock. And we had a guy, and that's when they brought Jim Sylvester over. And I had a guy named Charlie Vanderbalk who had worked with Jim before, and he had quit. And so Charlie had called Dan Saracon, who was our base manager, and said, I want to come work for Murphy. I heard he's going to be chief. And so Dan hired him, and he came back. Well, he no more got back here than I got promoted and demoted within 12 hours. And so Charlie decides, well, he's going to quit again, because he came down here to work for me. So he quit. Well, they didn't tell Jim. And so after about 2 weeks, Jim comes over to me and he says, where's Charlie? I haven't seen him in a couple of weeks. And I said, well, you need to go talk to your boss. And he comes back and he says, you know, Charlie quit. He's worked with me 2 times. He's quit both times. And I thought, you think, you know. Dan Saracon, who was our base manager, I was his boy. And if there was ever a problem, then I was the guy that he would seek out. You know, we're in the countdown, and he'd look around, he'd see a photographer, and he'd say, Murphy, get that guy out of here. And so I'd go and I'd start chasing this photographer, and he'd go out the door. I'd sit behind Dan at the test conductor console and watch all the green lights, where they're going. I'd say, okay, Dan, everything's ready. The board's green. So Dan reaches over one time and he says, engine start. Engine start happened at 28 seconds. And so I leaned over and I said, Dan, I hate to tell you this, but you just hit the reset button, not the start button. So he goes, oh man. So he hits the start button. Well, it really didn't matter, because everything's a relay logic anyway. It wasn't computer driven. It wasn't like we were going to launch at 0. In fact, we never knew when we were going to launch. You'd hit the engine start button, which started this long series of relays, and we pulled aft panels out and so forth. You never knew how long it was going to take. So when we got down at the end, we all were just watching the ladder lights, wondering where we were in this sequence. And eventually we would launch. It might be early, it might be late. So after the count, Dan comes over to me and he says, I do not want that to be on any record. Well, we had a set of what we called EA records, where if you threw a switch, you get a little mark on a graph. So I went out there and I took some spit, and I kind of smeared the ink at that point, so you really couldn't see that the pin jogged up and down, because Dan didn't want anybody to know it. Dan was a funny guy. I was sitting in a trailer one day, and I hear this page, the phone had been ringing in the trailer for about 5 minutes, and I hear this page, Murphy, I know you're in that damn trailer. Pick that phone up. And I go, oh my God, Theracon. So he was kind of, you didn't want to be chewed out by him because he was like a recorder. When he'd chew you out, he'd just turn around and start over again, just like they hit a loop button. And man, you just couldn't get away from him. So I had a hard hat that didn't have the insides to it. And so when I'd put this hard hat on, and this thing completely changes your look, and he'd come storming in madder than hell, and I put this hard hat on, and he'd go, he couldn't help but break up laughing. I go, Jawohl, Commander, and he'd just break up, you know. And so everybody used to put their hat on and walk around. It was quite a humorous event. We were having a count one day, and 50 minutes before launch, we always cleared the pad. So we blew horns and everybody cleared the pad because we were going to pressurize the vehicle. So we had already tanked fuel, and we were going to do a pressurization test. So they had cleared the pad, and they went to blow the horn, and the horn wouldn't work. Now these horns blow in the Pan Am, they didn't blow on, they were not a General Dynamics system. But it didn't matter to Dan. I was walking by and he says, Murphy, your damn horns don't work. Get up there and fix them. So I went and I got my two buddies, Ed Stewart and Johnny Marks, and we go up there, and we had these 4 big bronze horns that were sitting on a 1-inch piece of conduit which had the red, green, and yellow light on it. And as we reached over and touched it, the whole thing fell off the top of the blockhouse. And I thought, oh my God, I've demasted my General's blockhouse. We're going to launch the next day. So we dragged the bronze horns back up there, and we take them apart, and they're just full of rust because the compressed air that was ran out of the tank down under the blockhouse, the pipe had become rusted. And so I thought, what am I going to do? I busted all the lights and everything. So we took the horns, we had a railing up there, and we mounted them to a railing. And I was looking down the ICBM row, and we had all these blockhouses that were abandoned by then. And so I told my two techs, I said, we'll go get a van and a ladder. And they said, why? I said, don't worry, just come on. So we went down, we climbed over a fence, we went up to the top of the blockhouse, and we took a light off of a blockhouse that was down there, came back, and we came back up, and we wired it back up. And I thought, well, I got that solved anyway. So I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, guys. I'm going to go down there, we're going to blow the horns now, and I'm going to pour a little oil in there to coat so we won't get this rust again. So I go down there and I opened it and I said, okay, I'm going to blow the horn, okay. So I pour some oil in there, have the blockhouse monitor hit the horn button, and the horns go, boop, and all this oil comes out, and it's just a humongous cloud, and it's running down the top of the blockhouse too, so I'm staining the top of the blockhouse. So I said, oh, this is not good. So I told them, go ahead and keep blowing the horn. So they kept blowing the horn. Eventually, it worked properly. And about this time, I look up and coming down the road, and about 4 fire trucks and ambulance and police, and I thought, well, this ain't going to work out very well, I don't think. And sure enough, they turn into the complex, and they come screaming up, and the guy jumps out, and he says, what's the problem? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, you blow the horn 5 times, that's an emergency, and we react to that. So by this time, everybody else was going home. It was around 4:30 rather, and they were all leaving. And they were all walking out to their cars in the parking lot, and they were all coated with oil. And these guys are wiping, they're going, what in the world, where did this stuff come from? So Dan never said much to me. The next I guess about 6 months later, I was known for keeping parts in a trailer. And material people would call me up and they'd say, Murphy, we're throwing this out. And I'd go down, I'd pick it up, it'd be relays, switches, lights, connectors. And I had them all on the end of my trailer. And so Pan Am was told to move the trailer about 20 feet. So they came out with this massive forklift, and they went under the center and they tried to lift it, and the trailer broke in half because all the parts I had in the end. So after they decided, well, they're not going to move this trailer, they went and complained to Dan. So Dan calls me in and he chews me out for having all these parts. And he says, you know, inspection, you can't do that. We got to, you know. I said, okay, Dan, what do you want me to do? He said, I want you to get rid of all those parts. I said, okay, I'll do it after the launch. And so we go in, and we had on the console a static launch switch. If you were in a static position, you didn't send the command to release the vehicle. And if you're in the launch position, obviously you did. So he goes in there and we're getting ready to pick the count up, and he puts it in the launch position and nothing comes on. And this was about a 20 wafer switch. It was about that long. And so he says, Murphy, what's the problem here? So I check it out and I said, well, I tell you, but the switch is no good. And he said, well, get it replaced. So I called material up and I said, need to have this part number. And they called back and they said, well, here's the point. We don't have any of them, and it'll be 3 months before we'll get one. And we have to buy 1,000 of them at that time because the factory, that's such an old part, the factory had to restart their line back up again. So I go up to Dan and I said, okay, Dan, here's the point. We're going to have to wait 3 months, and when we do, we get 1,000 of them. So we'll have a lot of spares. And Dan says, how many of those switches you got out in your trailer? And I said, what do you mean, how many? I can't go out there and take those switches. He says, I'm asking you how many of those switches you got in your trailer. And I said, well, Dan, I got 2. And he said, well, you get your butt out there and you bring one of those switches back, you install it. And I said, you just chewed me out the day before because I got all these parts without inspection stamps. Now you're directing me to install this switch that doesn't have an inspection stamp on it. He said, do you ever want to raise again? And I said, well, I guess I get that. So I went out and got the switch. Never again did anybody say anything to me about having all these parts in this trailer, because we saved many missions because of them. Stop in a minute. After the Titan-Centaur project was the first time was concluded, I was sent back over to the Atlas-Centaur, and this was before I went on the Shuttle-Centaur. And when I went back to Atlas-Centaur, I took the position of lead engineer again, and I displaced a guy named Jack Rickling. And so I was sitting there at the desk, and I get a phone call, and I pick it up, and this gal says, is it Murphy, is that you? I said, yeah. Well, this is Jack's girlfriend, and I heard you took his job. And I said, yeah, that's the way it worked out. And she says, well, how would you like to have his girlfriend? I wasn't married at that time, and I go, oh, I don't think so. I think I'll hold off on this one if you don't mind. So we go over to Shuttle-Centaur. Shuttle-Centaur was a unique project in which we were going to fly a fully loaded Centaur inside the orbiter. And the project, when the CIS came down here, which the Centaur set in, it was so badly wired that I rejected the whole thing, and we could completely rewire the CIS. And then we had gone over to Spiff, which was the area where we checked the Centaurs out in the clean room, and we used to put the payloads on top of them. And we had taken the Centaur over there, Shuttle-Centaur, and I was installing pyrotechnics in it for flight, and yet the Centaur itself didn't have flight components on it. We had 3 computers that weren't even certified yet. And I thought, my gosh, we're going to put this thing in the back of the shuttle. The failure of the shuttle then canceled the program. But I've talked to Bob Springer, who was the lead astronaut on that program, and he said they didn't have a great feeling of sitting in front of a fully loaded shuttle Centaur full of LOX and hydrogen. Especially, they were worried about if they aborted what happened, because they couldn't land with the weight of the Centaur. So they had put 18 titanium bottles on the CIS, and we were going to blow all the propellants out of the orbiter before it landed, so they would be within weight. And I thought, well, that'll be an interesting experiment, especially if you got any flame with a bunch of LOX and hydrogen being blown out the side of a orbiter. But the program was canceled. During my 38 years before I retired, there was a lot of instances that you look at and you say, man, why did I do that? But I imagine I made 10 trips down to the vehicle holding it 28 seconds before launch to either adjust the umbilical and the technicians, they used to cringe when I'd come down the stairs because they thought, oh man, they're going to be picked to go. On F1, which was the first Atlas-Centaur, we had a problem where we had 2 connectors sitting next to each other, and one was the upper boom, one was the lower boom on the Centaur. And unfortunately, the connectors got reversed prior to launch. And so when we got down to launch, the umbilicals that were supposed to have been in at T0 were out, and the umbilicals that were supposed to be out at T4 were still in, which was not a very good thing, because the T0 umbilicals happened to be the fill and drain valves to drain the fuel off the vehicle. And also we couldn't get off of internal power. So we were in the blockhouse. The vehicle had shut down because we sent a cutoff because of the mix-up. And we were all sitting there laying on the floor calculating how long it was going to take before we were going to hear one big loud noise. And I looked over, and Roger Lynch was our base manager at that time, and he had his feet up on the test conductor's console, and he was laughing. And Bill Myers was laying there on the floor next to me, and he says, show me an idiot, show me a person that can laugh at a time like this, and I'll show you an idiot. And I thought, boy, that's honest truth, because we were just waiting. So we had a TV camera sitting on top of the hydrogen tank, the Centaur, first TV camera that was ever going to be flown in flight. And so we were looking at the level of the hydrogen in the tank. The reason the TV camera was there is they weren't sure what hydrogen was going to do in 0 gravity. So that was the main reason for it. So, but we were using it to see how long it was going to take us to boil off so we could get down to a safe level. Well, Bob Howey was our PSO, so when we finally got down to a level that was acceptable, Bob said, okay, we can send 6 guys in. So I went down, and there was a technician named Dick Haney, and I chose Dick to be our volunteer. And so these guys all ran to the pad. They brought the tower in. Dick ran up all 14 flights of the tower. They got the platform down, so he can get the umbilicals back in. And normally it was a two-man procedure, but he jammed those umbilicals in. We transferred back to external power. The mechanics got the fill and drain valves in so we could detank. And after all our little hearts settled down, we went back to the battery lab and we took the battery that was on top of the vehicle and loaded it up. It lasted 2 minutes before it failed. So we had 2 minutes of power left. And if we had slowly started to decrease, we would have gone below some of the switches on the autopilot system and they would have dropped off and fired. And we would have gone through separation, everything out on the pad. I decided that once Lockheed Martin bought us out in 1994, and I was the senior lead electrical engineer. And they call me up and they tell me that I need to go back to their school on launch control. And I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "I've designed almost all these circuits and everything, and you're telling me that I need to go back and be trained?" I said, "How about an AVO to retire?" So I retired in February of 1995 when I realized that when I used to, under General Dynamics, I was a design designee. If I needed to change, I could make the change. If I had a problem on the vehicle, it was up to me to make the decision to fix it. I would include San Diego in my decision, but I was the guy that made the decisions. So at that time, I took retirement. What we're looking at is the test conductor's console. The lights on the left, which are, a lot of them are burned out because we only put one bulb in there due to we're a museum and it costs $1.25 for each bulb. So anyway, these lights were what we called the green board. And the test conductor is sitting here. If all these lights were green, then he was able to, we'd get down about T-minus 28 seconds by this time, and then he would hit engine start. And this was the engine start button. But it wasn't that it started the engines, it actually started a relay logic that eventually got down to starting the engine. We would sit and look at these lights coming on. We never knew when they were going to come on because a lot of them depended upon mechanical functions, and sometimes they wouldn't come at the same time. So we'd be sitting there and we'd go, "Good grief, where are we?" Because we had no clue where we were in the count because it was not computer driven. It had nothing to do with a computer. If any time after 28 seconds there was a problem noticed by anybody, there was only one word that was ever said, and that was cut off. And the test conductor, he would sit there with his hand over this button, and he'd push the button, and that would stop the sequence. And then we'd recycle back to T-minus 5. The panels that you see starting over on the left and swinging around, these panels were put in 1962 by my engineers and techs, and we took them out in 2005. They were used for 70 launches, and you can't see the picture up on the, maybe you can, the picture on the wall. That is the blockhouse, and the consoles you see on the right-hand side are the consoles that are in this room. And the only difference is that we got what we call digital meters, and you can see them because they're the meters that are, you can read the writing analog meters are the meters that are on the first panel and hard to see. We changed them later. I didn't like it because when I had to make a reading, before on the analog meter, nobody knew what I could read reading because they couldn't see it. And when they put digital in, everybody in the blockhouse could see what. So since we had voltage drop from the vehicle back to the blockhouse, we had cheat sheets that the reading we had really wasn't the reading down there. We had a conversion factor, and they didn't have the conversion factor, but they'd be looking at these meters. They were throwing these consoles in the trash, and the young engineers that I had hired back in the early days were now big engineers, and through their efforts, I didn't hire them all. Just they were a class of what we call class of '83 out of UCF, but they were all big guys now, and they were willing to let us have them. So Space Walk of Fame went out there, and we retrieved them before they threw them in the Dempsey dumpster, brought them in here, and Dick Sweat and I went in and rewired each one so kids could come in and throw switches. And otherwise, we had a great thought at one time of running the countdown, but we got tossed out of Sears, and then we didn't have the room. So Max is going to go over and he's going to throw a switch, and what we do is we let one switch tied to a horn, and all we do is sit around and wait for the kids when they come in and throw in the switches and everything to push the button and jump. You'd think they've been shot, but they love it. Kids love to come in here. These switches have these panels have what we call toggle lever locks, rather. And lever locks switches are switches that you have to pull out on to make them work. And the reason they were changed, back in the early days, we had countdowns that could last maybe 36 hours because it was a struggle to get some of these vehicles off the pad. And we had a guy fall asleep, and his head hit the main power switch to the vehicle, shutting the vehicle down. So after that, we replaced all the switches we could with these lever locks. If he fell asleep again, he'd knock a hole in his head.